Hello and welcome to my channel. This is an introductory podcast to this new venture on my part. The title of, or the name for my channel is Ideas Have Consequences, and I have some notes here that I'm looking at so I can stay somewhat focused. Question number one, why did I start this channel? Unlike most of my contemporaries, and let me just say my contemporaries would be those in their 60s. My age is actually, I just turned 67 here, not too many days ago. Unlike most of my contemporaries, I do watch social media quite religiously. I actively follow a number of podcast personalities. Ben Shapiro is one. Very impressed with that young man. I enjoy his podcast because he has ideas and he stays true to his ideas, and he does not get off into celebrating personalities. I like especially that he will call out Donald Trump when Donald Trump does silly things, but he'll also defend him. I also listen to some of his fellow podcasters, and I should have written their names down because their names have escaped me right now. But I do enjoy hearing what they have to say. Here in Canada, Gad Saad is a professor that I listen to. Janice Fiamingo, who was an English professor at the University of Ottawa. I believe she's retired now. So those are two Canadians, and I am a Canadian, I should point that out. Also Lauren Chen, a young woman here in Canada, and I enjoy listening to what she has to say. A couple of other young women that I listen to from Australia. Daisy Cousins, I just recently started listening to her, and also to, the name is gone. I should have again written that down. But she's another activist in Australia. Out of the United States, a young lady that I started listening to a number of years ago, actually she was just getting started, and she goes by the name of Blonde in the Belly of the Beast. And I really don't know what her name is, but I've enjoyed watching her evolve over the years as she has moved from being a single woman living in Seattle and not at all happy with her situation to now where she is married, and I believe she's living in Idaho. I think that's right, but I could be wrong on that. So I've enjoyed watching and listening to her. Another Canadian woman that I listen to, she goes by the name of Girl Writes What. She's out of Edmonton, Alberta, and actually she was one of the first that I started listening to. What impressed me about her is that her educational background is probably not a whole lot different than mine, but she has garnered a great deal of respect based on the quality of her work. The reason I continued to listen to her was because it was very evident that this woman was intelligent, and that she also did her background research on the topics that she discussed, and she was coherent and articulate on her podcast, and so I appreciated what she had to say. There are a number of others that I listen to on occasion. Those are probably the ones that I listen to on a regular basis. One of the things that I've noticed is that the topics online are quite different from the topics offline. Now, I'm referring, of course, my social contacts would be people of my general age group, and so most would be retired now, and most of us would have the heavy influence that we would have had would be coming out of the latter half of the 20th century, where we were where we received our education and where we actively pursued our careers. I pay attention to the younger generation. I am interested in what they have to deal with and in their ideas and what has influenced them in the decisions that they make. And part of the reason for starting this particular this channel is that I'm hoping to receive feedback from the generations younger than myself as I express ideas. Now, I'm quite aware that there are those out there that have the intellectual capacity of a mouse, and all they are able to do is to be vulgar and call names. And if that's you, well, if that turns you on, I probably won't block you, but I will if it gets too bad. But I'm looking for intelligent, thoughtful interaction with the ideas, and I want to hear reasoning behind why you think the way you do. So that, in part, is also why I've started this channel. But the other thing is, as I told you, I was born in the middle of the last century, and so I have a fairly long period of life over which to reflect on at this stage. And because I'm retired now, I have more time to read and to listen to these podcasts and to reflect on the changes that have occurred. And trust me, there has been major changes that have occurred over the past decades that have gone by. So, because this is an introductory podcast, let me tell you a little bit of my life and the kind of world in which I grew up. I grew up on a small farm in rural New Brunswick in Canada, for those of you that are geographically challenged. We are on the east coast of Canada, and directly to our south is the state of Maine in the United States. My father and mother worked the farm together, but as was typical in those days, the division of labor was pretty well established between what happened inside the house and what happened outside the house. Inside the house was my mother's domain, and outside the house was my father's domain, generally speaking, but of course there were exceptions to that basic rule. Now, the time of life that I recall as starting school, I'd have been 4 or 5. Electricity, we had that, and we had probably one light bulb in every room and a couple of outlets for appliances, and that was about it. We heated our home with either wood or coal, because coal mining was something that happened around our area as well. We had a wood stove in the kitchen. There was no electric range or anything like that. And my mother cooked on that wood stove summer and winter. Well, in the wintertime, it wouldn't have been too bad, but I tell you, when she was cooking a meal in the middle of July, when the temperatures outside were probably approaching 30 degrees Celsius or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, that made for a really hot house. So the kind of work that my mother would be doing, things took a lot more time and a lot more energy and involved a lot more manual labor in those days. She prepared meals and prepared preserves for the long winter months. I do remember her working inside the house. She would get up and get breakfast for my father. I remember especially percolating coffee on the wood stove. And I recall sitting in a chair watching this coffee percolate, because it was a metal coffee pot, and the very top of the coffee pot was glass. So you could see when the coffee started to perk up through the glass to make the coffee at the prescribed taste that my father would have liked. And I loved the smell of coffee, hated the taste, but I loved the smell, and that was part of the daily routine. After that, of course, Dad would head outside to do the work that he needed to do, and Mom proceeded to do the work that she needed to do. And as I said, everything was, it was a lot more involved. Quick meals did not exist. We did not have prepackaged food, so everything had to be prepared from scratch. And so my mother would be preparing foods for the dinner time and supper time, as well as cooking, making cookies and cooking bread and the like. In the fall of the year, when the harvest came in, and I'm going to back up in a minute to what happened during the summer, but in the fall of the year, she was very busy, involved in preserving a lot of the vegetables that came in. She made pickles, and there are two kinds of pickles. And I'm not a cook, so you're going to have to excuse the limited explanation that I give you here, but it was one pickle was called Chow Chow, and I think that was primarily made out of tomatoes. And then there was another one that was called Lady Ashburnham pickles, and that was made out of cucumber and onion, and there was something else in there that I forget what it is. Plus she pickled beets and beans and other things so that it would last throughout the winter months. My mother also churned butter. I can remember her sitting in the middle of the kitchen and churning the butter. So let me just back up and explain that a little bit. We had a small farm, and we had about 5 or 6 cows, something like that, which my father milked daily. That was done by hand. There was no mechanized process to do that. It was milked into a pail, and that was brought in and dumped into what was called a cream separator, and it would be run through that mechanical process, and the cream and the milk would be separated out into its 2 different components. And my mother would use the cream to make the butter. And my memory isn't so good that I can remember how all of that process took place, but I know it was labor intensive and took a fair amount of time. We also had a couple of pigs. We also had chickens, and we also had a horse. Of course, the horse was for working on the farm. Tractors, we never owned a tractor. My father quit farming before the mechanization came in. The horse was used for preparing land for the garden. I can recall as a young boy, probably 4 or 5, hanging on to the single furrow plow that my father would use. And if you can imagine the handles that would roll back, and then there was a bar that ran between the 2 handles that he would have held on to. And that's what I held on to and I remember reaching over my head to hang on to that as I walked behind the plow. The horse didn't move that fast, so I could keep up. So that's a memory firmly etched in my mind during, like I said, I was 4 or 5 years old, but that's how gardens were prepared. All of the farming implements that we had were designed to be hauled by a horse. The other major activity that I recall is in the summertime, of course, hay had to be mowed and brought into the barn so the animals could be fed during the winter, and that was a fairly labor-intensive process. But I enjoyed the haying season because I got to participate, and that was because we had a horse. Now I'll explain that. I would have been about, like I say, 4 or 5 years of age, and of course I wanted to be right in the mix. And of course, at 4 or 5 years of age, I would be underfoot unless Dad was able to come up with a way to keep me occupied so I wasn't bothering anybody. So what happened is that he would put me on the wagon and give me the reins, and my job was, as he said, to drive the horse. Now, the reason I got that job, I learned as I grew older, is because the horse was smarter than I was at that time of my life. The horse did not need anybody to handle the reins. It responded by verbal command. And so my father would yell out the verbal commands, and then I would repeat it, of course, and think that I was doing something productive to help in this process of bringing the hay in. But the hay rather had to be raked or cut down and raked and put into bundles before it could be put into the wagon to be taken into the barn. And all of that process involved hours of labor, and it involved hours of labor out in the hot sun. Summer times in the Maritimes back in those particular days were fairly consistent and fairly warm. It was rare to have a cool summer, but they did occur now and again. But most of them that I remember were quite hot, and because from the time of being at age 4, I never missed a haying season until I got into my 20s. Of course, my responsibilities quickly moved beyond holding the reins for a horse. We had to take the hay. We used pitchforks to pitch the hay into the wagon, and then the wagon was taken to the barn, and then it involved pitchforks to get it out of the hay up into the hay mow. So that would kind of give you an idea of the level of work that had to go on. As I mentioned earlier, my mother cooked on a wood stove, and wood did not march itself out of the woods and cut itself and split itself to be put in the stove. So that was a job, again, that my father had to do. As I mentioned, he planted huge gardens so that we would have enough vegetables to last us during the winter. For me, those gardens were agonizing labor. For my father, they were fun. That was play for him. He enjoyed gardening. And long after he retired, up into his last years, actually, my father died at age 89, and he was still planting those big gardens because, as I said, for him, that was play. Life back in that time was tough for everybody. And the argument as to what was man's work and what was woman's work did not exist, simply because the work outside the house involved a fair amount of upper body strength. And that is where men have the advantage over women, especially. Also, the weather, which could run extremes from extreme heat in the summer to extreme cold in the winter. Most of men's work, as I said, was outside, and it was done in that kind of inclement weather. One didn't stop because it was unusually cold or unusually hot. The work had to be done, and it had to be done in a timely fashion. Work started at daylight, and it ended when it got dark. And sometimes especially a little later, the work lasted long after dark, especially as light got more sophisticated. As I said, I was involved in the haying process on the farm till my 20s, and my father wasn't farming at that time, but I had a cousin that lived right beside us, and he took over the farm, and I worked with him during the summer. He was the only active farmer because as time went along, people that had family farms stopped farming. But the hay fields were there, and the hay still had to be cut. And because my cousin was one of the few active farmers in the time, he cut the hay for a long way around us, which meant that we started haying as soon as the hay was ready. And we hayed right through the summer and sometimes into September. And I often remember our haying operation lasted after dark because we would have lights out there so that we could continue to hay even after the sun went down. So we could be haying up till 10, 11 o'clock at night. I also, at that period of time, and I started working in the summer at a sawmill when I was 15 years of age. And when I stop and think of 15-year-olds that I know today and what they do, it's hard to imagine that they would be able to do that kind of work. But that was fairly commonplace during the 60s when I was growing up. My father had to sign a special permission slip because I wasn't 16, and the law of the land said that unless you were 16 years of age, you couldn't work full-time. And my work was full-time at the mill during the summer. We worked a 50-hour week back then. That was, again, common. The workday was 9.5 hours when we worked day shift and 10 hours when we worked nights. During the day shift, we worked Monday to Friday, then half a day on Saturday. And when we were on night shift, we worked Monday to Friday. Remember, I also said I hayed. Well, that meant that when I worked at the mill during the day, we would get home and have supper and then go into the hayfield and work, as I said, oftentimes till after dark, go home, get into bed, have a night's sleep, and we had to be at work at 7 the next morning. And when we were working night shift, that, of course, just reversed. We had to be at work at 7 at night. So we'd get off at 6 the next morning, go home, we'd sleep till noon, and then get up and hay in the afternoon until it was time to go home and have a meal and get ready to go back to the sawmill. And that was the life that we led back in the 60s. So as you can tell, it was significantly different than the way people live their lives today. As I said, most of the work had to be done manually. And I worked in a sawmill, which meant that I handled a lot of lumber. And for those of you that may not be aware, when lumber is green, that is before it has been dried, that extra moisture makes it heavy. And so handling all of this lumber involved a lot of upper body strength. There were no women that worked in the sawmill back in the 60s. But that same sawmill today employs a lot of women because so much of the work that we did manually is now done by machinery. And so they are there to operate the machines. A lot of this debate between about the social contract that has taken place over, well, from the time of the 60s until even today, seems to me, based on my life experience, to be a lot of nonsense because the history that is being propagated, especially by the women's movement, is just flat out wrong. The notion of having power is a dumb notion because the vast majority of Canadians back in the 50s and 60s, the issue of power didn't exist. It was more a matter of accomplishing a goal. And the goal was that as people got into their late teens, early 20s, they got married and they had children and raised those children. And life revolved around those fundamental activities. Life was hard. It required two people working together, sharing responsibility, sharing work to accomplish everything that needed to get done. There was no concept of gaining power. Now, of course, there had to be those that took leadership positions, but they were few and far between. One of the things that I look at today in 2019, and I look at the people that are running for political positions, and especially the position of Prime Minister, because we're in the middle of an election campaign right now. Running for the Liberal Party is Justin Trudeau. For the Conservative Party, Andrew Scheer. We have a Green Party whose leader is Elizabeth May. We have a NDP party. Jagmeet Singh is the leader there. And then the newest political party on the scene is called the People's Party of Canada. and the leader of that party is Maxime Bernier. As I look at the qualifications of those that seek to who will become prime minister should their party succeed in winning the general election, the two major parties are the Liberals and the Conservatives. Now, the problem that I see there is when I look at the background of the two leaders, their education and their life experience and work experience, I have to ask myself, what happened to qualified leadership? Justin Trudeau comes to the position having been trained to be a teacher and actively working as a teacher for a number of years, but he also was a snowboard instructor. He was a bouncer. Andrew Scheer was elected to Parliament at age 25, and prior to that he worked in the insurance industry, and he started studying to get his insurance broker license but never completed it because, well, he got elected to Parliament and didn't proceed. So he has very little work experience as well, and I'm not sure what his educational background is. Justin Trudeau obviously would have a degree of some sort because he was a teacher. What in that background prepares them to run a country? We have budgets in the billions of dollars. They have to manage a civil service of thousands and thousands of people across the country. And that skill set is not something that you pick up overnight and requires a certain level of education in a specific area and life experience in a specific area. And the most qualified person to be able to do this job would be somebody that has a lot of business background, especially large business background. Now, here in the province of New Brunswick, we have a premier who has that kind of experience. Blaine Higgs spent 30 years working for the Irving Company. He started with this company straight out of a university as a engineer, and I just forget what kind of engineering degree that he had. But he started with the Irving Company at that time and stayed with that company throughout his whole career, working his way up to the position of being a director, where he had to manage hundreds of employees and million-dollar budgets. He was also involved in major negotiations for contracts that would have involved millions and millions of dollars. He is running our government now. The government that we had in the province before Blaine Higgs took it over was run by a young man by the name of Brian Gallant. He was, again, in his 20s when he was elected to the provincial legislature, and I believe when he was first elected premier of the province, he was in his late 20s. Now, I could be a little off on that, but I'm not far off. His experience, of course, would have been he was a lawyer, so he had a law degree, and he worked as a lawyer for, I think, 3 or 4 years. And he also ran some small businesses to help pay off his expenses while he was studying. So good on him. An industrious, smart young man, but woefully inadequate to take on the responsibilities of premier of the province of New Brunswick, and it showed. From day one of his mandate, and he was in for 4 years, there was controversy. Almost every new initiative that they undertook was a start and stop process. And there would be some kind of major controversy that would involve this new process because it was mishandled. Blaine Higgs has been the premier of the province now for a little over a year, and the political news in the province is positively dull by comparison to what it was when Brian Gallant was Premier. Because Blaine Higgs is running the province and thinking not like a politician, but like a businessman. He's concerned about efficiency. He's concerned about keeping our debts down. He's concerned about balancing budgets. He's concerned about motivating the civil service to do the very best job that they can. And it's paying dividends. The ministers of various portfolios that he has here in the province, he keeps them under control. And that's probably a bad word. He's not that type of person. But he insists on a certain level of performance, and he insists that these performances are measurable performances, just not talking about certain things. He wants to see in raw numbers how those activities are being carried out and what benefit can be attributed to the province of New Brunswick because of those activities. If the election was called, I think, today, Blaine Higgs would probably go back in as Premier with a majority government, simply because everybody, well, of course not everybody, but the majority of people are very impressed with how well he has conducted himself as Premier of the province. Of course, you have those ideologues that have something to complain about, but let's face it, nobody's perfect. And being a leader of a province or a country, you're bound to make mistakes and be called out on it. And kudos to our Premier. When he makes mistakes, he owns them and tries to make corrections. So I tell you all of that to give you an idea of my life experience and where I am coming from. These issues that are being discussed and fought over now, I see as being very detrimental to the ongoing successful life that we can have here in Canada and in New Brunswick. It's not about one group over another. I was brought up under a Judeo-Christian worldview, a worldview that I hold more strongly today than I did when I was younger, which places emphasis on the conduct of the individual, not on their group status. In my experience, and I have dealt with women and men who, some were white, some were non-white, some spoke English as their first language, some had French as their first language. None of that mattered. What mattered is, can they do the job? How do they behave? What is their conduct like? And the individual was accepted not based on their class or their group affiliation, but they were judged based on their individual behavior. And that's where I think we need to be. And any kind of discussion that does not involve dealing at an individual level is wrong and is going to cause unnecessary conflict in our country. And if policies are created based on those kind of ideologies, then the country will only suffer. In that regard, I have grave concern about the re-election of Justin Trudeau, since he is one of those ideologues who calls himself a feminist, and the policies that he has brought in place over the 4 years that he's been Prime Minister of this country have been atrocious and are only going to cause problems for this country. Rather than unifying the country, he's dividing it. At any rate, I could go on for probably another half hour, and I see I've already talked for a half hour. So I'm going to call it quits for now, and hopefully that this introduction has given you a fairly decent idea of who I am and where I'm going to be coming from as I discuss various topics in this channel. So the next video that I'm going to do is going to be around the issue of suicide. I am also, I didn't mention this, but I am also a news reader or news director of a small radio station here in the city of Fredericton. I've been doing this for over 3 years, so it wasn't my first career. But it has forced me to get into the news and look at the news in a more focused way than I ever did before. And in a news broadcast a few days ago, the two main stories in that were with regard to suicides that happened in the city of Toronto at the university, and also suicides that took place in the city of St. John. And I want to talk about that phenomenon on the next video. So thank you for listening. I hope you're going to continue to come back. If you do like the channel here, as everybody says, please click on the subscribe button and the little bell so that you can be notified when the new videos are up. And I look forward to hearing reaction and feedback from you. We will see you on the next video. Thanks for listening.